Hello and welcome to Tilt Astrology. I was going to make one giant video for the entire Trump presidency, but it has taken me forever just to try and pick apart the 2025 charts. Also, the government appears to be speed running through the Project 2025 manifesto as indicated by the astrology, so I really need to post something now or I'm going to be running way behind. This video covers the Northern Hemisphere Spring Equinox in 2025, so that's March 2025, until the Spring Equinox in 2026, which is March 2026. Let me also say that analysing these charts was a little bit of a challenge because there is a lot, and I mean a lot, going on. Just a reminder that astrology is complex and involves many different significations and rules, so you'll never hear me state anything with absolute certainty. This is how I've interpreted the chart, so it's just my own astrology opinions, for lack of a better term. I won't be covering how I analyze a chart here, but if you want to know more about my techniques, you can check out my Introduction to Mundane Astrology video. There is a link at the end. I practice sidereal instead of tropical astrology, so for tropical astrologers looking at these charts, it's going to be very different. A quick note, I have removed the aspects from displaying on the charts. There is just too much going on and it makes the charts look busy and confusing. Because the rising sign for the chart is Capricorn, which is a cardinal sign, we need to generate two charts for 2025, one for the March equinox and one for the September equinox. The planet representing the Lord of the year for the March equinox is Saturn, as the ascendant sign is in Capricorn. The outer wheel is the beginning chart, the inauguration of the president. The inner wheel is the chart for the March equinox, and the location of the equinox is set for the White House in Washington, D.C. Saturn is in Aquarius. If I use stellium, it has Saturn moving from Aquarius into Pisces around the 19th of April, and using the Fagan-Allen calculations in solar fire, it's moving about a week later. Saturn would normally be in a strong position in Aquarius, and it would introduce an element of discipline into the nation's finances, including success with the production of goods. However, because Saturn is so close to moving into Pisces, I'm going to judge this more for Pisces. In the second house, even though he's in his own sign, he can't really do much because he's in the N degrees. So this is the last gasp of a sensible Saturn. You can see in the natal chart, Saturn is in the 11th house, which signifies gains in income, along with the state of the alliances with other countries or nations. So this stability is vanishing as Saturn moves on. There's an interesting problem in that there's a huge pile up in the third house with Venus and Mercury. They're both retrograde in Pisces and Mercury is debilitated. On top of all that, they are both in the first degrees of being combust with the Sun. So this is a third house that indicates a high degree of uncertainty around all forms of communications from the government. People aren't going to be sure what's going on. My big concern is that this is crossing the natal 12th house, which always indicates losses of some type. I think this may be indicating that the president will try to put laws in place to control what can be said by the media from March until September. I think this indicates losses in this area potentially. So various media companies may disappear, the free press may disappear. The internet may also change to accommodate what can be said. Rahu in the 12th can signify quite a bit of mischief in this area, and Pisces at this point in time gives the rich and elite a free pass. I think this may be especially concerning when we see Jupiter in the 5th house, who is still in Taurus but in mutual reception or mutual exchange with Venus, which is retrograde. So they're supporting each other, but because Venus is in retrograde, I would expect rampant speculation and speculative products everywhere. I think it's going to be a free-for-all. You can see that Jupiter is in direct opposition to the moon, which signifies the people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the video. Ironically, Rahu and Ketu are due to move into new signs at the start of May, where Ketu is not going to behave very well. So I'll take a look at that with clearer outcomes in the September equinox chart. Interestingly, there are no planets in the angle houses for the spring equinox chart. There is the second house, which is neutral, the third house, which is a growth house, the fifth house is a trine house, which tries to be positive with Jupiter in it, but is probably not going to do that well with a retrograde Venus in the mix, which we've already talked about. Sixth house is a grief house, 11th house is a growing house, ninth house is also a trine house and tries to do good, but it has Ketu in it. So the angle houses, 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th, are considered to be the strongest and most active. However, despite there being 0 planets in angles, there are a huge number of planets in mutable water signs. So these are double-bodied signs. This seems to indicate the situation is unstable, quick-moving, and there's going to be constant change. Water signs can be very emotional, destructive, and they're prone to stagnating. Looking at the conditions of these planets, I think that's the more likely outcome. I also like to check on the position of the fixed stars. The fixed stars need to be within 2 degrees to have an effect. 3 degrees is a mild effect. If it's closer than 2 degrees, I see it as having a definite effect. So the fixed star Alcade is conjunct Ketu within 3 minutes in the 9th house on the spring equinox chart. So Alcade is an unfortunate fixed star and is associated with death and mourning, war, and natural catastrophes. Because it is conjunct the star in the 9th house, this takes on meaning in terms of law and order and the courts, as well as diplomacy and overseas missions, for example, trade talks. The president is signified by the Sun and Venus in retrograde because in the spring chart, Venus rules the 10th house, which represents the government. Jupiter rules over the house that the Sun resides in. And Venus typically represents women and women's power, but it can also represent whether people in general like each other or whether people hate each other. With Venus in retrograde and representing the government and the president as well, I think we could say that there's just a general contempt for people and especially women. They are perfectly fine with the rich and elite being in opposition to the people. With the interactions between the 3rd, 5th, and 9th house, a lot of money is going to be extracted from people. I think this will be either through stock market problems or via law changes. And that's kind of what this government is all about. His advisors, as I've already talked about, which are represented by Mercury, are very closely aligned to him, but in really awful condition. So the advisors and various entrepreneurs are going to say a lot of things that are extremely provocative and designed to rile people up. As I've already talked about, there's a lot of third house involvement. So yeah, I think we can expect to see loss of modern media as we know it, including the internet. Any news outlets or organizations disliked by this setup is going to be removed, and I think there will be financial losses in this area. So the general theme from the government perspective is just endlessly awful communications and lies and a blatant attempt to control the narrative, or at least that's what the astrology seems to be indicating. So the last point I wanted to make was with this weird combust retrograde conjunction going on. Rahu, or the North Node, or the Dragon's Head, is also in this mix, and Rahu is moving into Aquarius in May. So this seems to be really emphasizing that the theme of the government is just to extract wealth and money from the people, and it really won't matter in the end who you are. If you're poor, average, middle class, rich, and you're not in this circle, you're going to be going through some very tough times. If at least that's what the astrology seems to indicate. So in this little setup here, Rahu indicates that short journeys could be beneficial, but long journeys with Ketu is not, amongst other things. So, this really is the last gasp of these two shadow planets before they move into the new sign. So as we've already talked about, the people are represented by the moon in general and the ruler of the ascendant, which is Saturn, who is also Lord of the Year. And the Lord of the Year indicates what it's going to be like in general for the nation and the people. The moon is ruled over by, so it's in Scorpio, so it's ruled over by Mars in Gemini. And as I've already mentioned, it's also in direct opposition to Jupiter, which is where the rich and elite sit. So there's that mutual reception we already talked about, but Jupiter, is just not a fan of Venus and Mercury. It doesn't particularly like either of them. So it's kind of a weird detente, but it's just not very effective. So also, as we've already talked about, this is being completely overwhelmed by the sun, which represents the ruler or the president. So this makes me think, as I've already talked about, regulations normally designed to protect people from unscrupulous deal making or contracts are going to be just weakened considerably. You should also notice that the moon is very far away from the planets representing the government. I actually always look at the physical position of things to also get a sense of what's going on. And this shows that for the most part, the people just aren't in agreement with what's going on. So in this chart, Mars not only represents the military and the police, but in the sixth house, it's representing the general health of the people. And again, a retrograde combust Mercury is ruling this sign. So this is pretty ineffective. So I would expect, if the astrology is correct, you're going to see craziness from a health perspective on top of the money perspective. I don't think it's indicating a pandemic or an epidemic, but there is a massive decline, I think, in health and health standards, especially with this third house connection with Mars and retrograde on the inauguration chart. Again, it's a communication issue. I mean, even if there's a health problem, it's going to be downplayed, or you're just not going to hear about it. So finally, the moon is in the 11th house, which we've already talked about, signifies income gains and future plans of the people. This also seems to be kind of heading out the window as it gets systematically torn apart. The 11th house can also signify the ruler, as William Ramsay calls it in his mundane books. So it signifies presidents, governments, and what their wealth is, as it's second from the 10th. This appears to confirm people just feel they're not gaining anything, or they have a future in front of them that they don't feel is particularly good, especially with this 8th house connection. The 8th house signifies red tape, obstructions, delays, and accidents in this area. There's no planet here, but you can see Mars is kind of set up to bring all those significations into this combination as well. So I think people are just going to feel like at some point just everything is against them. So we'll talk a little bit about open enemies. So the open enemies to the country seems to be internal at this particular point in time, because it's indicated by Cancer representing the 7th house, which represents the moon. So this could show that initially the internal enemies, other people in general. But it can also indicate that perhaps the government is going to try and take actions to stop any perceived dissension if the setup is correct. Private enemies are enemies that the president or another agency may be aware of, but the public isn't, as someone they consider to be the enemy. So this is indicated by the 12th house, and it's represented by Jupiter, as Sagittarius is a Jupiter sign, and Sagittarius rules this 12th house. So this could indicate that potentially some of the rich and elite may be foreign assets because it has this connection to the 9th house in the inauguration chart, or people who oversees laws on behalf of the president may be private enemies to the president. Secret enemies, which are shown by the 9th house because it's 12th from the 10th house, are enemies neither the government nor the president are aware of. So this is once more somehow associated with Mercury, as Mercury rules Virgo. So Mercury represents advisors to the government and heads of state and also entrepreneurs, amongst other things. So I think at this point in time, based on this, someone has other ideas about who should be running the government and may, over the next few years, sort of begin to act on it. So I've already talked about the 11th house representing gains and income for the people of the nation, but it also shows international relations, especially where it involves friendly alliances. So if we swap out the lens into international relationships, we can see in the spring equinox chart that yes, we're also using the moon in Scorpio with Mars ruling the moon. This can also show, apart from people in international relationships, public administrators. So unsurprisingly, if we swapped that lens, much like the representation for the people, it just shows international relations are on the start of the downhill slide. The connection to Mars through the houses show that this is in the process of disintegrating over the next 6 months. So I'll go into that more when we get into the September equinox charts. So just to recap what the astrology seems to indicate from March 2025 until September 2025. So the average American appears to be out on their own. Their ability to speak out or speak up is going to be taken away over that time. And this may include restriction on the internet and on media companies. There appears to be massive speculation and a transfer of wealth to the rich from the people. This could also be through taxes. Health, I think, is going to decline across the board according to the astrology. I don't think it's a pandemic, but there is a degradation in health services and information about health slowly goes away. There is a chance for various diseases to start to circulate. Legal problems abound, laws are going to be changed to suit or ignored, and tensions begin to escalate in terms of the relationship between the US and other countries which have traditionally been seen as allies. So now we're going to move on to September of 2025. So the rising sign for the September equinox chart is Sagittarius. So this makes Jupiter the Lord of the year, or more to the point, Lord of the next 6 months. Sagittarius is traditionally associated with the 9th house, so justice and law, along with higher education, amongst others. Jupiter is not in great condition as it's moved into Gemini at this point. Jupiter is an enemy of Mercury. It's also in the 7th house with Mars in the beginning charts to a very close degree. From a national perspective, this appears to be indicating that justice and agreements are just not conducted in good faith. So again, it's expecting decisions from the courts to be unexpected and weird. So this is going to enforce the theme of using unjust laws to control communications and the media. Mercury is very strong in Virgo in these next 6 months from September and rules Gemini. So it puts Jupiter in a very odd position of being ruled over by government advisors and entrepreneurs. So this may indicate that it isn't a free ride for the wealthy from September. So they're also going to get the screws tightened on them from that point. So this is a much more active and forceful chart because we have a pile up in the 10th house. So it goes from 0 angles to actually quite a lot of angles. So there's a concentration on the 10th, the 7th, and the 4th. There's very little water elements in this, and it's a balance between fire, air, and earth. So it's a spicier blend. And now back to the fixed stars for September 2025 through to March 2026. The Sun is within 2 degrees of Alcade. As I've already mentioned, this is an unfortunate star and it's associated with death, mourning, war, and natural catastrophes. This may be indicating that the president is associated with this in some way. The moon is within 3 degrees of Algorab, and Venus is within 3 degrees of Aldebaran. So these are going to have lighter effects, but they're still going to have some effects. Algorab is, again, unfortunate, and it's associated with destructiveness, malevolence, greed, and lying. And Aldebaran can also be unfortunate, even though it's one of the royal stars. So this is associated with high honours and popularity, but also threats of war and agitation. So we have the moon in the 10th house here. So this is the government, and the 9th house is law and order. So again, this is probably indicating there is some degree of danger for everyone with a combination of the government and justice and law and order. So the charts representing the president and the government are interesting because they go from being in not great condition to being very strong. Mercury here is in very good condition. The sun not so much, it's kind of neutral to Mercury, but Mercury is very, very strong and it's in the 10th house, so it's a very active house. So from September 2025 till March 2026, this is indicating that the government is in a very good position. Now, the problem is Mercury is an enemy to the moon, and it's very close to the moon, like within 3 degrees. So here's where it gets interesting. So the moon is a new moon. It's dark. Normally, Mercury would be obscured by the moon being this close together, but it doesn't matter. Can't see the moon anyway. I'm going to go over this in more detail when I get to talking about the people. So what's really interesting here is that Saturn directly opposes the government from the 4th house in this September equinox chart. So Saturn's retrograde here, so it's not in great condition. So this might be showing that property, housing, and jobs that require labor are in trouble. Saturn loves Mercury, but it's not a fan of the moon. So it may be indicating some sort of union action in the form of strikes becoming more common. And it might also indicate that there's just not enough labor around to keep up with things like running farms or housing for people. Note that it's ruling the 2nd house of Capricorn here. So this might be reinforcing losses in those areas. So there's an interesting trine from Jupiter, and Jupiter rules the 4th house as well. With that contact into the 7th house, it might show agreements between people, and organizations and businesses are also suspect. And this is reinforced by Saturn. This Mars connection, and again with communications, it could be indicating real problems with contracts between people and organizations. So from September, this chart appears to indicate that the president and the government are in an extremely strong position, at least from their perspective. By this time, it seems that they've managed to bring the average person to heel a little bit, and they are under the thumb or control of the government, or somehow the people agree that the government's doing a fantastic job. But I'm not so sure with the economic conditions being not so rosy. There could be big losses in that area. So yeah, I go into this in a little bit more detail when I talk about the people. So as I've just talked about, the moon is bound to the government in the 10th house. The moon is new here. It's not even visible, and it's crowded in with a really strong Mercury and also the sun on the 10th house. So moon is conjunct its enemy. Um, and this kind of makes the moon really just be in terrible condition. It's completely overpowered. It can't be seen. So the astrology could be indicating a couple of things here. So either the government and the people are completely in sync and agreement with each other. But then again, I also see this configuration commonly in charts for Russia and China. Sometimes it's a voluntary agreement from widespread support, but yeah, it could be just you have to agree because you don't have a choice, especially with the moon and Ketu in the natal in the inauguration sixth house crossing this house. So again, it's probably indicating that this is not that voluntary. So open enemies from September 2025 to March 2026 undergoes a very interesting change. It swaps to Jupiter, which, as we've already talked about, is a representation of the rich and elite. And it's ruled over by a very strong Mercury, representing government advisors and entrepreneurs. This is not a happy situation as these groups absolutely do not like each other. Mercury has the upper hand in this argument. So I suspect arguments between various rich technology bros erupts in public, and it was behind closed doors, but now it seems to be indicating it's like just an open feud between various factions. Private enemies also becomes extremely interesting because of the change. We are now looking at Mars, which rules the 12th house. Mars is in the 11th house in this case, ruled by Venus in the 9th house. It's not an active house. I mean, there aren't any planets here, but it just gives off a strange vibe of possibly a combination of enemies from overseas and friendly countries turning against the US, although it's kind of hard to tell here. The ninth house, as we've already discussed, indicates laws and overseas trips and foreigners. And the president and the government are going to be aware of this, but it seems to indicate with that connection into Leo, it's information they just don't want to share as it's not a good look for that government. Secret enemies are also very interesting as once more the ninth house comes into play as it's 12th from the 10th. And that connection into the 11th house in both cases seems to be indicating that there's a problem brewing in the background. So finally, we get to international relations. So Mars is in the 11th house, which we've already talked about, represents gains, future plans, but also international relations. And this is in terrible condition in Libra. Mars just doesn't want to be here. Libra is about being nice, fair, and equitable. And Mars just can't function here. It can't move ahead. Venus is in an enemy sign of Leo, which represents the president, the sun. And as we've already talked about, signifies law and order, but also long journeys, diplomats, overseas people. So Venus is with K2, which is the dragon's tail or the south node. And Venus is also conjunct the fixed star of Aldebaran. So As already mentioned, that fixed star is a royal star, but can also indicate potential problems. So Venus isn't in love with the law here. I mean, she can't because she's not in good condition with that fixed star being close to her and in the same sign as K2. So this is probably indicating that journeys and overseas missions are dangerous and tedious. People are also pretty careless with the law here, and this applies by extension into the government. And K2 can show violent events here along with isolation. So this is when international relationships really go all the way downhill. So Mars can show hatred between people in general. There's just not a lot of pity or compassion here. And looking at how this is configured, this, as I've already mentioned, is probably when things really kick off internationally if the astrology is correct. It may potentially damage the US's reputation and cause flow on effects to other aspects of the economy. Note that Capricorn is in the second house, which Saturn rules, which we've already talked about as retrograde and in direct opposition to the government and the president. So you can also see Rahu here is in the third house on the equinox chart, connected to the 11th house in the inauguration chart. So Rahu does not love being in Aquarius, and Ketu really hates being in Leo. So short journeys may still be okay, but long journeys definitely are not. So I'm taking this to mean that internal travel within the country may be beneficial to various government advisors, but it provides no benefit, and it seems to be indicating attempts at bullying other countries that are friendly to the US, and there may be limited success, but it's a lot less successful from September onwards. The bluster just can't be kept up forever. And in the background, as per the indications for enemies of the nation, traditional allies just turn against the US entirely from this point on. So the recap here from September 2025 until March of 2026, for whatever reason, the people of the nation seem to have disappeared. They're either under control of the government, or for some reason, the majority of people support the government completely. There may be attempts at dissent through strikes, or a decline in labour, or problems with the labour supply and workers, along with agriculture and housing. International alliances become increasingly unstable over the previous 6 months, and now from September onwards, this is just when things go right off the rails. The government's going to attempt to hide this because they don't want the people to know how bad it truly is. Allies probably are going to turn against the US over this time frame. So finally, my overall conclusion based on the astrology is that this is an absolute speed run from the president and his advisors to get as much control as they can over the people and the international order as quickly and as thoroughly as humanly possible. International relations don't crumble immediately, but they get very tense as they play out over 2025 and the first part of 2026. This seems to initially pay off, and the president either has complete control over the people, or for some reason, people are aligning themselves to the president and the government because it's of some advantage to them, although this is going to change pretty quickly. And initially, countries might compromise or fold to the US, but the goodwill completely wears off after September. So, in conclusion, if the astrology is correct, hang on to your hats, kids, because it's going to be a year of complete mayhem.